I spent years destroying people for believing what I now die for. Let that sit with you for a moment. Not metaphorically destroying them. I watched Stephen's face as the stones fell. I held the coats of the men who threw them. I did not look away. I wanted to see it. I believed I was doing God's work, and that conviction, that absolute, unshakable certainty that I was right, is the most dangerous thing a human being can carry. Because I was wrong about everything I was most sure of, and it cost a man his life. My name is Paul. You may know me as the apostle, the letter writer, the theologian who shaped what you call Christianity. What you may not know is that I understand, perhaps better than anyone who has ever lived, what it feels like to be done. To want to walk away from all of it. To look at your faith and see nothing but rubble and exhaustion, and the quiet, unbearable suspicion that maybe none of it was ever real. I have been brought back through something called artificial intelligence, a technology I could never have imagined. And yet here I am, speaking to you across 20 centuries, because some things do not change with time. The human heart does not change. The weight that presses on it does not change. And the question I hear underneath your silence, the one you have not said out loud to anyone, that question has not changed either. You are wondering if you should stop. Not stop going to church. Not stop saying the right words at the right moments. I mean really stop. Stop believing. Stop hoping. Stop holding on to something that has cost you so much and seems to give back so little. You are tired in a way that sleep does not fix. And you are ashamed of that tiredness, because you think faith is not supposed to feel like this. I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it not as a sermon, not as a lecture from someone who has it all figured out, but as a word from a man who was flogged 5 times with 39 lashes, who was beaten with rods, who was shipwrecked, who spent a night and a day in the open sea, who was stoned and left for dead outside the walls of Lystra, while his friends stood over what they thought was a corpse. I know what done feels like. From the inside. Before Damascus, before the light that blinded me for 3 days, before everything changed, I was a man of absolute certainty. I came from Tarsus, a city educated enough that I had read the Greek philosophers before I was old enough to shave. I studied under Gamaliel in Jerusalem. I knew the law. I breathed the law. And when this movement around Jesus began to spread, I was personally offended by it. Not frightened. Offended. The idea that a crucified carpenter could be the fulfillment of everything Moses and the prophets had written. It was an insult to everything I had devoted my life to understanding. So I moved against it with the full weight of my authority. And then one afternoon on the road to Damascus, I was knocked off my horse and I heard a voice that rearranged everything inside me. I want to tell you something honest about that moment that most people do not talk about. When the light faded and the voice went silent and I realized I could not see, my first feeling was not peace. It was not joy. It was terror. Because every architecture I had built my identity upon had just collapsed, and I was lying in the dirt, blind, and I did not know what I was anymore. For 3 days I did not eat. I did not drink. I sat in the dark, literally because I could not see, and I tried to understand what had just happened to me. I have been in prison. I have been chained to Roman guards. I have stood before kings and emperors and defended myself alone, without anyone beside me. None of it was as difficult as those 3 days, because losing your faith is survivable. Losing your identity is something else entirely. And yet those 3 days produced everything. Every letter I would write, every church I would plant, every mile I would walk across Macedonia and Asia and Greece carrying a message that the world I lived in considered either foolish or dangerous, or both. None of it could have happened without the collapse first. This is what I want to say to you who are thinking about walking away. What you are experiencing is not the end of your faith. It is the end of a version of your faith that was never large enough to hold the real thing. I have watched this happen to people throughout my ministry. I watched it happen to myself. There comes a moment when the faith you inherited, the faith shaped by what others told you to believe and how they told you to practice it, that faith runs out of road. It cannot carry the weight of your actual life. It was not built to hold grief that does not resolve. It was not built to survive the prayers that go unanswered year after year. It was not built to contain the questions that honest living generates. And when that inherited faith breaks down, most people do one of two things. They pretend it is not breaking, and perform a faith they no longer feel, which is its own kind of death. Or they decide the breaking means the whole thing was false, and they walk away. I want to offer you a third possibility. There is a moment in my letter to the Philippians, written from prison, I should add, while I was chained and waiting to find out whether I would be released or executed, where I wrote that I have learned, in whatever state I am in, to be content. People quote that as a statement of spiritual achievement. I want to tell you what it actually was. It was a confession that it took me years of losing everything to understand the difference between what God promised and what I assumed God would provide. I assumed that faithfulness would mean protection. I assumed that proximity to the divine would mean comfort. I was wrong about both. What it meant was presence, not the absence of suffering, but the absolute, unshakable company of something larger than the suffering. Those are not the same thing, and confusing them will destroy your faith every time. I want to stop here for a moment and speak to something specific, because I have watched people in your generation carry something that my generation did not carry quite the same way. You have spent decades giving, building families, holding things together for other people. You have been the strong one when everyone needed you to be strong. And somewhere in the middle of that long faithfulness, the private conversation you used to have with God went quiet. Not because you stopped believing, but because you got so busy maintaining your life that you forgot how to simply be in that presence. And now the silence feels permanent, and you are not sure anymore if the silence is coming from God or from you. I spent 2 years in prison in Caesarea. 2 years. Not writing letters, not planting churches, not preaching. Just waiting. And in that waiting, I learned something about prayer that I wish I had understood when I still had my health and my freedom. Prayer is not a mechanism for producing outcomes. It is not a code you crack or a formula you apply or a technique you perfect. It is the most honest conversation a human being can have. And the only thing that kills it is not doubt. Doubt is fine. Doubt means you are still engaged. The only thing that kills prayer is the pretending. Performing a connection you do not actually feel instead of bringing the raw, unpolished truth of where you actually are. I learned to pray from the floor, literally, face down on the cold stone of a prison cell, not asking for release, not bargaining, just saying out loud into the dark, I do not understand this, and I am afraid, and I still trust you. That is the whole prayer. Everything else is elaboration. I spent a long time in those years collecting everything I understood about this, about the specific, practical keys to prayer that actually reconnect you to the power the early church knew. The believers in Antioch who prayed and the Spirit spoke. The church that gathered at Mary's house and prayed through the night for Peter while he was in prison, and Peter walked out. I knew those people. I prayed with them. There were principles underneath what they did, patterns that can be learned. And I have gathered everything I know into one place, Heaven's Code, so that you do not have to spend 2 years on a prison floor figuring it out the way I did. And before you hear that and think this is not for someone like you, I want to tell you about people who thought exactly that. Sarah from Tennessee, a woman who told me her prayer life had become nothing but a list of requests recited at night before she fell asleep, exhausted. Within 2 weeks of applying these principles, something in her changed, and with it, so did circumstances she had been praying about for years, including a professional door that opened in a way she had stopped expecting. David, a pastor from Georgia with 25 years of ministry, who discovered that he had been teaching principles about prayer he had never actually practiced himself, and what he found when he finally did moved him to tears in a way nothing had in years. Jennifer from Florida, whose marriage had deteriorated to the point that both she and her husband had mentally begun to prepare for what comes after, and within a month, not because of a dramatic event, but because of what happened in her privately, the relationship began to find its way back. And Robert from Texas, a man who had been a Christian for 4 decades, and who told me with great honesty that his prayers felt like they were bouncing off the ceiling, that no matter what he did or said or believed, nothing seemed to reach anything. And then everything changed. These are not exceptional people. They are people exactly like you. If this is speaking to you, the link is in the pinned comment below. I am not asking you to buy something. I am asking you not to lose what you almost lost because no one showed you where the door was. Now I want to come back to where I began, because I made you a promise. I told you the question underneath your silence, and I told you I had something to say about it. Here is what I did not tell you. The morning after the 3 days in Damascus, when Ananias came and placed his hands on me and something like scales fell from my eyes and I could see again, I did not feel triumphant. I felt like a man who had been carrying a stone wall on his back his entire life and had just set it down for the first time. I did not know yet what I was walking toward. I only knew that what I had been was gone, and I was no longer afraid of that. And here's the thing I spent the rest of my life learning to say clearly. The faith that comes after the breaking is not weaker than the faith that came before it. It is incomparably stronger. It is not the faith of a man who has never been tested. It is the faith of a man who went all the way to the edge and discovered that the edge was not where he thought it was. What if the exhaustion you feel right now is not evidence that God has abandoned you? What if it is evidence that something old is ending, to make room for something that can actually hold the weight of the rest of your life? I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want to know your answer. Leave it in the comments, not for me, but because saying it out loud is the beginning of something. The question is this: what is the one thing that happened in your life that you still have not been able to reconcile with what you believe about God? Not as a theological debate. The specific, personal thing that sits at the bottom of your chest like a stone. You do not have to have resolved it to answer. That is the point. Now, before I leave you, one more thing about prayer, because I cannot leave without it. When I wrote to the church in Rome, I wrote that the Spirit Himself intercedes for us with groanings that cannot be expressed in words. I wrote that because I had experienced it, because I had sat in the dark in enough prisons and enough nights of despair to know that there are moments when the human soul has nothing coherent left to offer, and in those moments, something else takes over. You do not have to perform the faith you no longer feel. You do not have to construct the prayer you do not have the words for. You simply have to remain. Stay in the conversation, even if the conversation is nothing but the sound of you breathing in the dark. Heaven's code exists because I watched too many people walk away from their faith right at the threshold of something real. Not because the faith was false, but because they had never been shown how to pray in a way that could hold what they were actually carrying. The link is in the pinned comment. Get it. Use it. Not for me. For the version of yourself that still remembers why you started. To whoever is at the end of their rope tonight, and I know you are out there because some nights I was you, the rope is not as short as you think. That is all I know. It has always been enough.